The radio crackled with desperation. "We need immediate close air support. Multiple casualties. We're surrounded." In the operations center at Bagram Air Base, Afghanistan, seasoned pilots shook their heads. The mission was too dangerous, too risky. The weather was deteriorating, the terrain was unforgiving, and the enemy had superior positioning. Even the most experienced A-10 Thunderbolt pilots deemed it a suicide run. But, in the corner of the briefing room sat Lieutenant Sarah Phoenix Martinez, fresh out of flight school with barely 200 hours in the A-10. While others saw an impossible mission, she saw something else entirely: 8 Navy SEALs who would die if someone didn't act. What happened next would rewrite the rules of close air support, challenge everything the military thought they knew about rookie pilots, and turn a young woman who had been told she wasn't ready into a legend whispered about in special operations circles around the world. This is the story of how being turned down for battle became the very reason she was the only one brave enough to fight. Lieutenant Sarah Martinez had dreamed of flying the A-10 Thunderbolt since she was 12 years old. Growing up in a small town in Texas, she would lie on her back in the summer grass, watching military aircraft fly overhead from the nearby Air Force Base. But it was the distinctive sound of the A-10's twin engines and that unmistakable BRRRT of its GAU-8 cannon that captured her imagination completely. The A-10, nicknamed the Warthog, wasn't the fastest or prettiest aircraft in the Air Force inventory. It was built around its massive 30mm cannon and designed for one primary purpose: close air support for troops on the ground. While other pilots dreamed of supersonic fighters, Sarah was drawn to the A-10's mission of protecting soldiers in the most dangerous moments of their lives. Her journey to the cockpit hadn't been easy. Flight school was brutal, with instructors who seemed determined to wash out anyone they deemed unfit for combat. Sarah was smaller than most of her classmates, quieter, and had a tendency to overthink situations that required split-second decisions. Her instructors noted that while she was technically proficient, she lacked the aggressive instincts they believed were necessary for close air support missions. "Martinez flies like she's afraid to break something," was a common critique during her training evaluations. What they didn't understand was that Sarah's careful approach came from a deep respect for the responsibility she would carry. Every bomb she dropped, every strafe run she made, would be dangerously close to American forces. One mistake could mean killing the very people she was trying to protect. When she finally earned her wings and was assigned to the 354th Fighter Squadron at Bagram Air Base in Afghanistan, Sarah thought her real journey was just beginning. She had studied every manual, memorized every procedure, and spent countless hours in simulators preparing for the moment when she would finally support troops in combat. But reality at Bagram was far different from what she had expected. The squadron was filled with veterans who had been flying combat missions for years. They had developed an informal hierarchy based on experience and proven performance under fire. As the newest and youngest pilot in the unit, Sarah found herself at the bottom of that hierarchy. While other pilots were assigned to high-priority missions supporting major operations, she was relegated to routine patrol flights and training exercises. Captain Rick Hammer Thompson, the squadron's operations officer, made his position clear during Sarah's first week at Bagram. "Listen, Martinez, I know you're eager to get into the fight, but combat isn't a place for learning on the job. Out here, mistakes get people killed. You need to pay your dues, prove yourself in low-risk situations before we can trust you with real missions." Sarah understood the logic, but it was frustrating to watch other pilots launch on critical missions while she flew circles over empty desert. She spent her time studying intelligence reports, learning the geography of Afghanistan's most dangerous provinces, and building relationships with the forward air controllers who would guide her strikes if she ever got the chance to fly combat missions. The forward air controllers, or FACs, were the critical link between pilots and ground forces. These specially trained airmen embedded with Army and Marine units, talking pilots through complex strike missions while enemy bullets flew around them. They appreciated Sarah's attention to detail and her willingness to learn from their experiences. Staff Sergeant Mike Chaos Rodriguez was one of the most experienced FACs at Bagram. He had directed hundreds of strikes and had a reputation for staying calm under the most intense pressure. During their briefings, he would share stories about missions that had gone wrong, usually because of poor communication between pilots and ground forces. The difference between a good pilot and a great pilot isn't how fast they can get ordnance on target, Rodriguez told Sarah during one of their sessions. It's how well they can understand what's happening on the ground and make smart decisions when everything goes to hell. 3 weeks into her deployment, Sarah's first real test came during a routine patrol over Helmand Province. She was flying with Captain Thompson when they received a call from a Marine unit that was taking light fire from a small group of insurgents. It was a perfect training mission: clear terrain, minimal civilian risk, and a straightforward target. Thompson took the lead, marking the target area and preparing for a gun run. But, as they approached, Sarah noticed something in the thermal imaging that didn't look right. What appeared to be a small insurgent position from altitude looked more complex when she studied the heat signatures more carefully. "Hammer, I'm seeing multiple heat sources spread across a wider area than we initially thought," she reported over the radio. "This might be more than a small harassment team." Thompson was already committed to his attack run and didn't want to abort based on the observations of a rookie pilot. "Phoenix, trust the ground forces. They know what they're dealing with. Maintain overwatch while I take out the target." As Thompson's rounds impacted the primary target area, Sarah watched her thermal display with growing concern. The heat signatures she had noticed earlier began moving in coordinated patterns that suggested a much larger enemy force than anyone had expected. Within seconds, the Marine unit below began taking heavy fire from multiple directions. "We've got a problem down here," came the urgent call from the ground. That was just the tip of the iceberg. "We're taking fire from at least 3 other positions." Sarah found herself in the kind of situation that separated good pilots from great ones. The Marines below needed immediate support, but the enemy positions were scattered and difficult to distinguish from potential civilian structures. Thompson was already turning for another attack run, but Sarah could see that his approach would only address one of the threat areas. Without waiting for orders, Sarah began coordinating with the ground controller to identify the multiple enemy positions. Her careful study of the terrain paid off as she was able to distinguish between active fighting positions and empty buildings. Over the next 20 minutes, she guided Thompson through a series of precise strikes that systematically eliminated the threat while avoiding any civilian casualties. When they returned to Bagram, the mission was deemed a success, but Sarah noticed that she received little credit for her contributions. In the debrief, Thompson focused on the successful neutralization of the target without mentioning Sarah's critical observations that had prevented a potential disaster. This pattern continued over the following weeks. Sarah would fly as wingman on routine missions, provide valuable support and observations, but remain relegated to a supporting role. The squadron leadership seemed determined to keep her in a training status indefinitely. The situation reached a breaking point during a briefing for a major operation in the Kunar province. Intelligence indicated that a high-value target was meeting with local insurgent leaders in a compound near the Pakistan border. The mission would require multiple aircraft and precise coordination with special operations forces on the ground. As the squadron leadership assigned pilots to various roles in the mission, Sarah expected to at least be included as a backup or support aircraft. Instead, she was assigned to remain at Bagram on standby status in case any aircraft experienced mechanical problems. "Sir, I've been training for missions exactly like this," Sarah said to Captain Thompson after the briefing. "I know the terrain in Kunar, I've studied the intelligence reports, and I'm fully qualified for this type of operation." Thompson's response was blunt and deflating. "Martinez, this isn't about your qualifications on paper. This is about combat experience, and you simply don't have it. These special ops guys don't have time to babysit a rookie who might freeze up when things get intense. Maybe next time." That night, Sarah sat in her quarters reviewing the mission plans that she wouldn't be flying. She had joined the Air Force to make a difference, to protect the soldiers and Marines who were fighting on the ground. Instead, she was watching from the sidelines while others carried out the mission she had trained her entire adult life to perform. What Sarah didn't know was that the mission she had been excluded from would go exactly as planned. The high-value target would be eliminated, and all aircraft would return safely to base. But 72 hours later, a different kind of mission would arise. One that no experienced pilot would be willing to fly. One that would require someone who had been told she wasn't ready to prove that sometimes being underestimated is the greatest advantage of all. The irony was that all her careful preparation, all the studying that her instructors had dismissed as overthinking, and all the patience she had developed from being held back would combine to make her the only pilot capable of succeeding when the impossible mission finally came. But, first, she would have to convince her superiors that the rookie they had been protecting from combat was actually the pilot they needed most when everything went wrong. The mission had started as a routine reconnaissance patrol. SEAL Team 7 was tasked with gathering intelligence on insurgent activity along the Afghanistan-Pakistan border, a region known for its rugged terrain and hostile population. What should have been a quiet observation mission turned into a nightmare when the 8-man SEAL team stumbled into the largest insurgent gathering anyone had seen in months. Petty Officer First Class Jake Spider Hernandez was the team leader, a veteran of 4 deployments who had earned his reputation through careful planning and flawless execution. His team had been inserted via helicopter the previous night into a mountainous area known locally as the Valley of Death for its history of ambushes and firefights. The intelligence reports had indicated minimal enemy activity in the area, suggesting it would be safe for a small reconnaissance team to operate for 48 hours before extraction. What the intelligence reports had missed was a large-scale meeting of insurgent leaders from across the region, all gathering to plan coordinated attacks against coalition forces. Spider's team had established an observation post on a rocky outcrop overlooking a small village. For the first 12 hours, they observed normal civilian activity, farmers tending their fields, children playing in the streets, and the usual routine of rural Afghan life. But, as evening approached, everything changed. Vehicles began arriving at the village from multiple directions. Not the typical civilian trucks and motorcycles, but military-style vehicles carrying armed men. Through their high-powered optics, the SEALs could see weapons being unloaded, communication equipment being set up, and what appeared to be a command structure being established. "Command, this is Reaper 7, Spider whispered into his radio. "We've got eyes on what looks like a major insurgent gathering. At least 40 military-age males with weapons, multiple vehicles, and what appears to be senior leadership. Request permission to continue observation." The response from their operations center was immediate: maintain surveillance and gather intelligence on the meeting. This was exactly the kind of information that could prevent future attacks and save American lives. But, as the SEALs settled in for a long night of observation, they had no idea that their position had already been compromised. A local shepherd had spotted their helicopter insertion the previous night and reported it to insurgent contacts in the village. While the Americans thought they were invisible observers, the insurgents were already planning how to surround and eliminate them. The attack came at dawn, just as Spider's team was preparing to transmit their intelligence report. The first indication of trouble was the sound of vehicle engines starting simultaneously throughout the village below. Within minutes, armed insurgents were climbing the hills toward their position from 3 different directions. "Contact! Contact! Multiple enemy forces moving toward our position!" Spider shouted into his radio as bullets began impacting the rocks around their hiding spot. "We need immediate extraction and close air support." What followed was a running gun battle through some of the most unforgiving terrain in Afghanistan. The SEALs were forced to abandon their observation post and begin moving toward a potential landing zone several kilometers away. But, with insurgents flanking them from multiple directions and reinforcements arriving by the hour, it quickly became apparent that they were surrounded. The team's radio operator, Petty Officer Second Class Tommy Ghost Williams, managed to maintain communication with their operations center as they moved. His reports painted an increasingly desperate picture: multiple enemy forces, rough terrain preventing helicopter extraction, and diminishing ammunition supplies. "Command, Reaper 7 is taking heavy fire from at least 3 separate enemy groups," Ghost transmitted during a brief pause in the fighting. "We've got wounded and we're running low on ammo. We need close air support immediately or we're not going to make it to the extraction point." The request for close air support initiated a chain of events at Bugram Air Base that would test every pilot's courage and skill. In the operations center, the air support request was received with the urgency it deserved. 8 American Special Operations Forces were surrounded and facing annihilation. Every available aircraft needed to be considered for the rescue mission. But, as the operations staff studied the tactical situation, they realized why this mission was so dangerous. The SEAL team was surrounded in mountainous terrain that severely limited aircraft approach routes. The weather was deteriorating rapidly, with low clouds and high winds that would make precision strikes extremely difficult. Most concerning of all, the enemy forces were positioned close enough to the Americans that any airstrikes would have to be delivered with surgical precision to avoid hitting friendly forces. Major Robert Ice Patterson, the squadron commander, gathered his most experienced pilots for an emergency briefing. The situation was explained in stark terms: 8 SEALs were surrounded and would be overrun within hours unless they received close air support. But the mission parameters were unlike anything they had faced before. The weather is marginal at best, Major Patterson explained, pointing to the meteorological data on the briefing room screen. Ceiling is dropping below safe minimums for close air support, and winds are gusting to 40 knots. The terrain limits our approach routes, and the enemy has had time to position anti-aircraft weapons. The most experienced pilot in the room, Lieutenant Colonel David Viper Stevens, studied the tactical display with a grim expression. Stevens had flown over 200 combat missions and was considered one of the best close air support pilots in the Air Force. His assessment was sobering. "Sir, with respect, this mission is outside acceptable risk parameters," Stevens said carefully. "The combination of weather, terrain, and proximity to friendly forces makes this extremely dangerous. We could easily end up killing the people we're trying to save." Other senior pilots nodded in agreement. Captain Thompson, who had been so critical of Sarah's readiness for combat, was among those who felt the mission was too risky. "We need to find another way to get those SEALs out of there. Maybe a ground relief force or waiting for the weather to improve." But Major Patterson knew what everyone in the room was thinking but not saying. There wasn't time for alternatives. The SEALs were running out of ammunition and had wounded members who needed immediate medical attention. If they didn't receive air support within the next few hours, they would all be killed. As the discussion continued, Sarah Martinez sat in the back of the briefing room, listening to pilots she respected explain why the mission couldn't be flown. She studied the tactical display, the weather data, and the communication transcripts from the SEAL team. While others saw insurmountable obstacles, she began to see possibilities. The terrain that limited approach routes also provided concealment for aircraft that knew how to use it. The weather that made precision strikes dangerous could also mask aircraft movements from enemy forces. Most importantly, the proximity to friendly forces that made other pilots nervous was exactly the kind of close air support mission that she had been training for her entire career. During a brief pause in the discussion, Sarah stood up from her seat. "Sir, I'd like to volunteer for this mission." The room fell silent. Major Patterson looked at her with surprise and concern. "Martinez, this isn't a training mission. This is as dangerous as close air support gets." "Yes, sir, I understand that," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the tension in the room. "But I've studied the terrain in this area extensively. I know the approach routes, I understand the weather patterns, and I've trained specifically for danger close missions." Captain Thompson immediately objected. "Sir, with all due respect, Martinez doesn't have the combat experience for a mission this complex. We need our most experienced pilots on this one." Sarah took a deep breath before responding. "Sir, our most experienced pilots have just explained why they think this mission is too dangerous to fly. Maybe what we need isn't experience telling us why it can't be done. Maybe we need someone who's willing to figure out how it can be done." The room remained silent as Major Patterson considered the situation. He had 8 SEALs who would die without air support and experienced pilots who believed the mission was unflyable. Standing before him was a rookie pilot who was volunteering to attempt what his veterans considered impossible. What Major Patterson didn't know was that Sarah had been preparing for exactly this kind of mission since her first day at Bagram. While other pilots were flying routine patrols, she had been studying the terrain maps of Afghanistan's most dangerous regions. While others were focused on standard procedures, she had been developing new techniques for operating in marginal weather conditions. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on anyone in the room. The pilot who had been deemed not ready for routine combat missions was now volunteering for the most dangerous mission any of them had ever seen. But, as reports continued to come in from the surrounded SEAL team, it became clear that conventional thinking and standard procedures weren't going to save them. Major Patterson made a decision that would be talked about in military aviation circles for years to come. "Martinez, you understand that this mission has a high probability of failure and an even higher probability of getting you killed?" "Yes, sir, I understand," Sarah replied. "But I also understand that 8 Americans are going to die if somebody doesn't try." The final irony was that all the caution and conservatism that had kept Sarah from flying dangerous missions had actually prepared her perfectly for this moment. Her careful study of procedures, her obsessive attention to detail, and her methodical approach to problem solving would all prove essential when facing a situation that required both precision and courage. But first, she would have to survive the most dangerous approach in A-10 aviation history, navigate through weather that was barely flyable, and deliver precision strikes within meters of American forces. All while insurgent fighters with anti-aircraft weapons waited for any pilot brave enough to try. The pre-flight briefing was unlike any Sarah had experienced during her training. Major Patterson personally walked her through every aspect of the mission, emphasizing the extreme dangers she would face. The weather had continued to deteriorate, with cloud cover dropping to just 800 feet above the valley floor and wind gusts reaching 45 knots. These conditions were well below the normal minimums for close air support missions. "Martinez, I want you to understand exactly what you're volunteering for," Major Patterson said, pointing to the tactical display. "The SEAL team is surrounded on 3 sides by insurgent forces estimated at over 100 fighters. They've had time to position anti-aircraft weapons, and they know aircraft will be coming to help. This is going to be the most heavily defended target you'll ever face." The terrain added another layer of complexity to the mission. The valley where the SEALs were trapped was surrounded by mountains rising to over 10,000 feet, creating a natural funnel that would force Sarah to approach from predictable directions. The insurgents would be waiting for her, weapons trained on the narrow corridors where aircraft would have to fly. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, the forward air controller who would guide Sarah's strikes from the ground, joined the briefing via radio from the operations center. His experience with danger-close missions would be critical to the success of the operation. "Phoenix, I've been talking to the SEAL team leader on the ground. Their situation is deteriorating rapidly. They've got 2 wounded, they're down to about 30% ammunition, and the enemy is closing in from multiple directions." Sarah studied the latest intelligence reports as Rodriguez continued his briefing. The insurgent forces weren't just a random collection of fighters. Intelligence indicated this was a coordinated operation led by experienced commanders who understood small unit tactics. They had effectively surrounded the SEALs and were systematically closing in, using the terrain to their advantage. "The good news is that the SEAL team has thermal marking devices that will help you distinguish them from enemy forces," Rodriguez explained. "The bad news is that some of the enemy positions are less than 50 meters from our guys. You're going to be making danger-close strikes in weather conditions that barely allow visual contact with the ground." As Sarah completed her pre-flight preparations, she was joined by Captain Lisa Torch Anderson, one of the squadron's most respected pilots. Anderson had volunteered to fly wingman on the mission, providing backup and additional firepower if needed. Her decision to participate gave Sarah confidence that experienced pilots recognized the importance of the mission, even if they weren't willing to lead it themselves. "Martinez, I've never flown a mission this dangerous," Anderson said as they walked toward their aircraft. "But those SEALs down there are depending on us, and I'd rather try and fail than not try at all. You take the lead, I'll follow your instructions, and we'll figure this out together." The A-10 Thunderbolt that Sarah climbed into that morning was loaded for maximum effectiveness in close air support. Her aircraft carried a full complement of 30mm cannon ammunition, precision-guided bombs, and rockets. More importantly, it was equipped with the latest targeting systems that would allow her to distinguish between enemy forces and the SEALs she was trying to protect. As Sarah started her engines and completed her pre-flight checks, reports from the ground continued to paint an increasingly desperate picture. The SEAL team had been forced to move again, leaving behind some of their equipment to escape an insurgent flanking maneuver. They were now in an even more precarious position, with limited cover and diminishing options for movement. The flight to the target area took 35 minutes, during which Sarah mentally rehearsed every aspect of the mission. She studied the terrain maps one final time, reviewed the locations of friendly forces, and coordinated with Rodriguez on the ground control procedures they would use once she arrived in the target area. As they approached the valley, the reality of the weather conditions became apparent. Cloud cover was dense and low, forcing Sarah to fly much lower than normal to maintain visual contact with the ground. The wind was strong and variable, creating turbulence that made precision flying extremely difficult. "Phoenix, this is chaos," Rodriguez's voice crackled through her headset. "Reaper 7 is in contact and taking heavy fire. They need immediate support at grid coordinates 4127 to 6589. Multiple enemy positions surrounding friendly forces. This is danger close, I say again, danger close." Sarah could hear the sound of gunfire in the background of Rodriguez's transmission. The situation on the ground was deteriorating by the minute, and she was still several minutes away from being able to provide support. Every second counted now. As she flew into the valley, Sarah encountered her first major challenge, locating the SEAL team among the rocky terrain and scattered vegetation. The thermal imaging system that was supposed to make identification easy was partially obscured by the low cloud cover. She would have to rely on visual identification and radio communication with the ground controller. "Phoenix, Reaper 7 is marking position with infrared strobe," came the call from Spider, the SEAL team leader. "We're taking fire from the north and east. Enemy positions approximately 75 meters north and 50 meters east of our position." Sarah could see the infrared strobe through her night vision equipment, but the enemy positions were much harder to identify. She needed to find them without exposing her aircraft to anti-aircraft fire for too long. The insurgents had learned from previous encounters with A-10s and knew that the aircraft's low flight profile made it vulnerable to small arms fire and rocket-propelled grenades. "Chaos, Phoenix has eyes on friendly strobe," Sarah transmitted to Rodriguez. "I need you to talk me onto the northern enemy position first. They appear to have the best field of fire on our guys." What followed was a deadly game of hide and seek among the mountains. Sarah had to identify enemy positions that were deliberately concealed, approach close enough for accurate weapons delivery, and avoid the anti-aircraft fire that erupted every time she became visible to the insurgents below. Her first attack run targeted a group of insurgents who had positioned themselves in a cluster of rocks about 100 meters north of the SEAL team. The challenge was delivering accurate fire without hitting the Americans who were dangerously close to the target. Sarah lined up her approach, using the terrain to mask her aircraft until the last possible moment. "Phoenix, you are cleared hot on the northern position," Rodriguez called as Sarah began her attack run. "Friendly forces are marked with infrared strobes 100 meters south of target." The sound of the A-10's GAU-8 cannon is unlike any other weapon in the military arsenal. When Sarah squeezed the trigger, 3,900 rounds per minute of 30 mm depleted uranium shells streaked toward the insurgent position. The effect was devastating and immediate. The enemy fire from the northern position stopped abruptly. "Phoenix, that's a direct hit." Spider's voice came through the radio with obvious relief. "Northern position is neutralized. We're still taking fire from the east and west." But Sarah's first attack run had revealed her presence to every insurgent in the valley. As she climbed away from the target area, tracer rounds from multiple positions began reaching toward her aircraft. She could hear the distinctive crack of bullets passing close to her canopy. "Phoenix, you've got multiple AAA sights lighting you up," Anderson called from her wingman position. "I can see at least 3 different gun positions tracking you." Sarah had expected anti-aircraft fire, but the volume and accuracy were more intense than anything she had encountered in training. The insurgents had positioned their weapons to create overlapping fields of fire that would make subsequent attack runs even more dangerous. "Torch, I need you to suppress the anti-aircraft positions while I work on the enemy forces near the SEALs," Sarah directed. "Can you identify the gun positions from your angle?" "Affirmative, I've got eyes on 2 positions on the ridgeline." "I'm cleared to engage AAA sites?" "You are cleared hot on anti-aircraft positions," Sarah confirmed. "Let's give these guys something else to worry about." As Anderson began her attack on the anti-aircraft positions, Sarah turned her attention back to the insurgent forces that were closing in on the SEAL team. The situation was becoming more complex by the minute, with friendly forces, enemy fighters, anti-aircraft weapons, and two A-10s all operating in the same small valley. The next phase of the mission would test every skill Sarah had learned during her training. She would need to coordinate multiple attack runs while avoiding anti-aircraft fire, maintain constant communication with forces on the ground, and deliver precision strikes in weather conditions that made visual identification extremely difficult. But the most challenging part was yet to come. Intelligence reports indicated that insurgent reinforcements were moving toward the valley from multiple directions. What had started as a rescue mission for 8 surrounded SEALs was about to become a much larger battle, with Sarah and Anderson as the only thing standing between the Special Operations Team and complete annihilation. The rookie pilot who had been told she wasn't ready for combat was about to face the kind of sustained air-to-ground battle that veteran pilots had nightmares about. But she was also about to discover that all her careful preparation and methodical training had prepared her for exactly this moment. Sometimes the pilot who studies the hardest is the one who performs best when everything goes wrong. The battle had been raging for over an hour when Sarah realized that the mission had evolved far beyond a simple rescue operation. What started as close air support for 8 surrounded SEALs had become a sustained air-ground engagement against a large insurgent force that seemed determined to make a stand in the valley. "Phoenix, we've got movement on the southern ridgeline," Spider's voice crackled through the radio with increasing urgency. "Looks like at least 20 more fighters moving into position. They're trying to cut off our escape route completely." Sarah glanced at her fuel gauge and felt her stomach tighten. She had been flying at low altitude in combat conditions for over an hour, which consumed fuel much faster than normal cruise operations. Her aircraft still had enough fuel for another 30 minutes of combat operations, but that assumed she could complete the mission and return to base without complications. The complexity of the situation was unlike anything covered in her training scenarios. She was simultaneously coordinating attacks on multiple enemy positions, avoiding anti-aircraft fire from at least 4 different locations, maintaining communication with ground controllers, and managing her aircraft's fuel and ammunition supplies. Most challenging of all, she was doing this in weather conditions that continued to deteriorate. "Chaos, I need an updated situation report," Sarah called to Rodriguez. "How many enemy positions are we dealing with now?" Rodriguez's response painted a picture of a rapidly expanding engagement. "Phoenix, we're tracking at least 6 separate enemy groups converging on Reaper 7's position. The original force that surrounded them has been reinforced by fighters moving in from 3 different directions. Best estimate is 150 to 200 insurgents now in the immediate area." Captain Anderson, flying wingman in her own A-10, had been working to suppress anti-aircraft positions but was facing her own challenges. "Phoenix, I'm taking heavy ground fire every time I make an attack run. These guys have learned how to shoot at A-10s. They're leading their targets and using coordinated fire." The insurgents had indeed learned from previous encounters with American close air support. Rather than fleeing when aircraft appeared, they had chosen to fight, using the terrain and weather conditions to their advantage. Their anti-aircraft tactics were more sophisticated than usual, with multiple gunners firing in coordinated patterns designed to force aircraft into predictable flight paths. Sarah's next challenge came from an unexpected direction. As she lined up for another attack run on insurgent positions east of the SEAL team, her radar warning system alerted her to a new threat. Intelligence reports had indicated that anti-aircraft missiles weren't present in the area, but the electronic signature her aircraft was detecting suggested otherwise. "Phoenix, Torch, be advised we may have SAM sites in the area," Rodriguez transmitted after receiving updated intelligence from higher headquarters. "Unmanned aerial vehicles have detected what appears to be shoulder-fired missile launchers on the northern ridge." Shoulder-fired surface-to-air missiles represented a significant escalation in the threat level. While A-10s were designed to survive small arms fire and even some anti-aircraft artillery, a direct hit from a modern portable SAM system could bring down any aircraft. Sarah would now have to factor missile threats into her attack planning. "Roger, Chaos. Can you get me specific locations on the suspected missile sites?" Sarah asked while scanning the terrain below for signs of the launchers. "Working on it, Phoenix. UAV assets are trying to get better imagery, but weather is limiting their effectiveness too." The situation on the ground was becoming equally desperate. The SEAL team had been fighting continuously for over 3 hours and was running critically low on ammunition. Their wounded team members needed immediate medical attention, but helicopter extraction was impossible as long as the valley remained under insurgent control. Phoenix, Reaper 7, Spider's transmission carried exhaustion and growing desperation. We're down to about 15% ammunition. 2 of my guys need immediate medical attention. How much longer can you stay on station? Sarah did the math quickly in her head. With current fuel consumption rates and the distance back to Bagram, she had perhaps 20 minutes before she would be forced to leave for fuel. But 20 minutes wouldn't be enough to clear the valley of insurgent forces and enable helicopter extraction. Reaper 7, I can give you another 20 minutes before I have to depart for fuel. But I'm going to make those 20 minutes count. What Sarah decided to do next went against every conservative principle that had guided her training. Instead of methodically attacking individual enemy positions, she would attempt a series of rapid, aggressive strikes designed to break the insurgent assault before her fuel ran out. Torch, I need you to suppress anti-aircraft fire for the next 15 minutes, Sarah called to Anderson. I'm going to make continuous attack runs on the main enemy concentrations. This is going to be dangerous, but it's our only chance to break their attack before we run out of fuel. Anderson understood immediately what Sarah was proposing. Phoenix, that's going to expose you to massive ground fire. These guys are ready for us now. I know, but we don't have a choice. Those SEALs won't survive another hour without suppressive fire, and we won't be back for at least 90 minutes after we refuel. What followed was 15 minutes of the most intense close air support action that anyone involved would ever experience. Sarah began a series of attack runs that brought her aircraft within dangerous proximity to insurgent positions. Her goal was to deliver maximum firepower in minimum time, disrupting the enemy assault long enough for relief forces to arrive. Her first run targeted the largest concentration of insurgents, approximately 40 fighters who had positioned themselves for a final assault on the SEAL team's position. Sarah approached at extremely low altitude, using a ridgeline to mask her aircraft until the last possible moment. The volume of ground fire that erupted when she became visible was unlike anything she had encountered. Tracer rounds filled the air around her aircraft like deadly fireworks, and she could hear the distinct sound of bullets striking her airplane's armored hull. Taking hits. Taking hits. Sarah transmitted as she completed her gun run and pulled up sharply to avoid the mountainous terrain ahead. Phoenix, how bad is the damage? Anderson called with concern obvious in her voice. Sarah quickly scanned her instruments and found that despite the sound of impacts, her aircraft systems were functioning normally. The A-10's reputation for survivability was well-deserved. All systems green. The Warthog is tougher than I am. Her attack had been devastatingly effective. The large insurgent formation that had been preparing to assault the SEAL position was scattered and disorganized. But Sarah knew that the enemy would regroup quickly and that she needed to maintain pressure to prevent them from reorganizing. Over the next 10 minutes, Sarah made 6 more attack runs, each one targeting different enemy positions around the valley. She was flying by instinct now, using her intimate knowledge of the terrain to find approach routes that minimized her exposure to anti-aircraft fire while maximizing the effectiveness of her weapons. The sustained attack began to have the desired effect. Intelligence reports from UAVs circling high above the engagement area indicated that insurgent forces were beginning to withdraw from their positions around the SEAL team. The combination of accurate airstrikes and the SEALs' determined ground defense had convinced many of the fighters that their assault was failing. But Sarah's aggressive tactics had come at a cost. Her aircraft had sustained multiple hits from small arms fire, and her fuel situation was becoming critical. She had perhaps 5 minutes of combat time remaining before she would be forced to depart for base. Phoenix, Reaper 7, Spider's voice came through the radio with the first hint of optimism she had heard all day. Enemy fire is decreasing significantly. Looks like they're pulling back from our immediate perimeter. How much longer can you stay? Reaper 7, I've got about 5 more minutes before I have to depart for fuel, Sarah replied. Are you in a position where you can hold until relief forces arrive? Spider's response would determine whether the mission had been successful or whether they would have to repeat the entire engagement when Sarah returned with fuel. Phoenix, if you can keep them off us for another few minutes, I think we can hold until the cavalry arrives. We've got word that ground relief forces are about 15 minutes out. Those final 5 minutes felt like hours as Sarah made her last attack runs of the engagement. She targeted the remaining anti-aircraft positions, ensuring that follow-on aircraft would have a safer operating environment. Her precision strikes and Anderson's supporting fire had systematically eliminated the insurgent threat. As Sarah finally turned away from the valley to begin her flight back to Bagram, she could see the dust clouds of approaching ground vehicles in the distance. The relief force was arriving just as she departed, timing that would save the SEAL team and complete one of the most successful close air support missions in recent military history. Phoenix, Reaper 7, Spider's final transmission carried genuine emotion. I don't know how to thank you. You saved 8 American lives today. We won't forget this. But, as Sarah flew back toward Bagram with her fuel gauges approaching empty and her aircraft bearing the scars of intensive combat, she knew that the most challenging part of the mission might still be ahead. She would have to land an A-10 that had sustained multiple combat hits, debrief a mission that had pushed the boundaries of acceptable risk, and face questions about her decision to volunteer for an operation that senior pilots had deemed too dangerous to attempt. The rookie who had been told she wasn't ready for combat had just completed one of the most challenging close air support missions in A-10 aviation history. But, the real test would be whether the military establishment would recognize her achievement or punish her for taking risks that went against conventional wisdom. The approach to Bagram Air Base was unlike any Sarah had ever flown. Her aircraft had sustained significant battle damage, with multiple bullet holes in the wings and fuselage, but the A-10's legendary toughness had brought her home. As she lined up for landing, emergency vehicles positioned themselves along the runway, unsure of what condition her aircraft might be in after the intensive combat mission. Major Patterson stood in the control tower, watching Sarah's aircraft approach through binoculars. He had been monitoring the mission through radio communications and UAV feeds, witnessing close air support tactics that were both brilliant and borderline reckless. The pilot he had reluctantly allowed to fly the mission had not only survived but had accomplished something that veteran pilots thought impossible. Tower, Phoenix requesting priority landing, Sarah transmitted as she entered the traffic pattern. Aircraft has sustained battle damage but all systems are functioning normally. As her wheels touched the runway, Sarah felt a combination of exhaustion and relief that she had never experienced before. The mission had lasted over 4 hours, during which she had flown some of the most challenging combat operations of her career. But, more importantly, she had successfully protected 8 American Special Operations Forces who would have died without her intervention. The post-flight inspection of Sarah's aircraft told the story of how close she had come to disaster. Maintenance crews counted over 30 bullet holes in various locations, including several that had passed within inches of critical flight systems. One round had penetrated the cockpit area, passing through the space where her head would have been if she had been sitting slightly differently. Chief Master Sergeant Williams, the squadron's senior maintenance supervisor, shook his head in amazement as he examined the damage. Lieutenant, I've been working on A-10s for 20 years, and I've never seen an aircraft take this much damage and continue flying effective combat missions. You were flying an airplane that should have been heading home after the first few hits. But, the physical damage to her aircraft was nothing compared to the firestorm of controversy that Sarah's mission created within the squadron leadership. Captain Thompson, who had opposed her participation in the mission from the beginning, was vocal in his criticism of her tactics during the post-mission debrief. Martinez flew outside acceptable risk parameters for the entire mission, Thompson argued during the heated debrief session. She made attack runs that exposed her aircraft to unnecessary danger and violated several standard operating procedures for close air support. Major Patterson found himself in the unusual position of defending a rookie pilot against criticism from his most experienced aviators. Captain Thompson, the mission was successful. 8 American lives were saved, and both aircraft returned safely. Results speak for themselves. Sir, we got lucky, Thompson insisted. Martinez's aircraft should have been shot down. Her tactics were reckless, and if we start encouraging that kind of flying, we're going to lose pilots and aircraft. The debate continued for over an hour, with senior pilots divided over whether Sarah's mission represented exceptional heroism or dangerous recklessness. What none of them initially understood was that their argument was being closely monitored by higher headquarters, where senior officers were drawing their own conclusions about the mission. 3 days later, Sarah received orders to report to the office of Brigadier General Patricia Hayes, the senior Air Force officer responsible for close air support operations throughout Afghanistan. The meeting would determine whether her actions in the valley would be recognized as heroic or result in disciplinary action for violating standard operating procedures. General Hayes's office was located in the secure section of Bagram's headquarters building, surrounded by intelligence displays and communication equipment that connected Afghanistan operations to command centers around the world. As Sarah entered the office, she noticed that several other senior officers were present, including representatives from Special Operations Command. "Lieutenant Martinez, please have a seat," General Hayes said with an expression that revealed nothing about her intentions. "We need to discuss your mission in the Kunar Valley 3 days ago." Sarah had prepared for this meeting by reviewing every aspect of her mission, analyzing her decisions and considering how she might have approached situations differently. She was ready to defend her actions but also to accept responsibility for any mistakes she had made. "Sir, I understand that my tactics during the mission were unconventional," Sarah began. "I made decisions in the moment based on the tactical situation and the immediate threat to American forces on the ground." General Hayes studied Sarah carefully before responding. "Lieutenant, I've reviewed the after-action reports, the UAV footage, and the communications transcripts from your mission. I've also spoken with the SEAL team leader whose life you saved." The general paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle before continuing. "What you accomplished in that valley was nothing short of extraordinary. You flew a mission that experienced pilots considered impossible, and you succeeded through a combination of skill, courage, and tactical innovation that we rarely see." Sarah felt a wave of relief, but General Hayes wasn't finished. "However, your squadron leadership has raised concerns about your tactics and whether they represent appropriate risk management. Some of your attack runs brought you within dangerous proximity to enemy forces, and your decision to continue fighting despite significant aircraft damage concerned your superiors." Colonel Michael Havoc Rodriguez, the Special Operations representative present at the meeting, leaned forward to address Sarah directly. "Lieutenant, I've been coordinating with Special Operations forces for over 20 years. What you did for SEAL Team 7 represents the finest example of close air support I've ever witnessed. Those men are alive because you were willing to take risks that other pilots weren't." The conversation that followed would reshape how the Air Force thought about close air support doctrine and pilot training. Sarah found herself explaining tactical decisions that had seemed instinctive at the time but which represented innovations in how A-10s could operate in challenging environments. "Ma'am, during the mission I realized that standard attack profiles were predictable and exposed aircraft to concentrated anti-aircraft fire," Sarah explained to General Hayes. "I began using terrain masking and varying my approach angles to minimize exposure while maximizing weapons effectiveness. Those tactics aren't taught in any training program I'm familiar with," General Hayes noted. "Where did you learn them?" "Ma'am, I developed them during my off-duty time by studying terrain maps and thinking about how to overcome the tactical challenges presented by Afghanistan's geography. I spent months analyzing successful missions and failed missions, trying to understand what made the difference." General Hayes exchanged glances with the other senior officers present. What they were hearing suggested that the Air Force's most junior A-10 pilot had independently developed tactical innovations that could improve close air support effectiveness throughout the theater. The meeting concluded with an announcement that surprised everyone involved, including Sarah. "Lieutenant Martinez, effective immediately you're being assigned as an instructor pilot for close air support tactics. You'll be responsible for teaching other pilots the techniques you used during the Kunar Valley mission." But the recognition extended far beyond a new assignment. Within weeks, Sarah's mission became a case study taught at Air Force training schools around the world. The tactical innovations she had developed were incorporated into official doctrine, and her willingness to volunteer for an impossible mission became an example of the courage and initiative expected from Air Force pilots. 6 months later, Sarah stood before a formation of newly graduated A-10 pilots at Bagram Air Base, preparing to give them their first briefing on close air support operations in Afghanistan. Among the audience were several of the same pilots who had initially criticized her mission in the Kunar Valley. Close air support isn't about following a checklist or applying standard procedures to every situation, Sarah told the new pilots. It's about understanding that American lives depend on your willingness to adapt, innovate, and take calculated risks when the situation demands it. As she looked out at the faces of pilots who would soon face their own moments of truth in combat, Sarah reflected on how much had changed since that morning when she volunteered for a mission that nobody else would fly. The rookie pilot who had been told she wasn't ready for combat had not only proven her worth but had redefined what was possible when skill, courage, and determination combined at the moment when they were needed most. The story of her mission spread far beyond military circles, inspiring a generation of pilots who understood that being underestimated could become the greatest advantage of all. Sometimes the person everyone counts out becomes the one who changes everything when the stakes are highest and failure isn't an option. In the special operations community, Sarah became known simply as Phoenix, the pilot who rose from the ashes of conventional thinking to accomplish the impossible. But, for the 8 SEALs whose lives she had saved, she would always be remembered as the rookie pilot who proved that when everything goes wrong, sometimes what you need most is someone who refuses to accept that success is impossible. Years later, when military historians analyzed the evolution of close air support tactics in Afghanistan, they would point to Sarah Martinez's mission in the Kunar Valley as the moment when everything changed. The pilot who had been turned down for battle became the one who showed everyone what was possible when courage and skill combined with the determination to never leave anyone behind.